Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
I don't know.
Senator
what was the space of time? August. Okay, it was 3 days. Jesus. So I wonder if they could have just, because a lot of the reasons I hear behind the bombing of the atomic bombings of Japan in World War II by the USA is that they wanted to stop the war without an American invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. But why not give more time for the Japanese to realize that, yeah, this bomb is real before dropping a second one? It seems like 3 days, especially considering the time, is just not enough time for them to be like, okay, this is actually real. Did you have to drop the second one? I don't know. Let's learn, guys. Imperial War Museum's preemptive like, original link top of the description. My name's Connor if you're new. Hello, guys. Let's learn.
Uncovered a troubling in March 1944, a Missouri senator uncovered a troubling discrepancy in America's defense spending. Millions of dollars were being funneled into a mystery project simply labeled expediting production. Determined to get to the bottom of things, the senator approached Henry Stimson, the US Secretary for War, who urged him to drop his investigation immediately as a matter of national security. It was only when he ascended to the presidency that Harry Truman would learn that those millions of dollars had gone into the Manhattan Project.
Wait, so wouldn't he have already been vice president?
Which successfully tested a nuclear bomb only a few months later. Now President Truman was faced with a terrible decision, but he didn't hesitate to make it. In the space of just 3 days, the world's first and last atomic bombs used in war decimated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
This is, by any estimation, a defining moment, not just in the history of the 20th century, but in the history of humanity. From this moment onwards, and for the future of humanity,
I'd say it's anyway. In the history of humanity, he said that. I agree. Yes, a scale up of weaponry, I don't think has ever been done, even from non-gunpowder to gunpowder weapons. I think the atomic bomb test by the USA in was it Los Alamos is one of the greatest events in history. I mean great. I hope you know what I mean when I say greatest. I don't say like awesome, but just significant. Just such the only time where we're like, okay, we have gone too far with creating weapons to the point now everyone can die.
humanity, there will always be the bomb.
The atomic bombings of Japan are widely credited as the single event that ended the Second World War. But was it the only reason that Japan decided to surrender? How was the decision made to drop the bombs, and where? And did they really need to do it twice?
So by me looking up the 3 days in between, I'm not sure if they needed to do it twice, but I know that a big part was that they wanted to show that they were already looking past the Second World War into their eventual conflict with the Soviets in order to show them that we have this weapon, I believe is a reason.
In July 1945, the war in Europe was well and truly over, but the war in the Pacific raged on. At the Potsdam Conference that same month, the Allied leaders demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The reality is that the war in Japan has been enormously challenging, enormously costly from the Americans' perspective, and they know that if they have to mount the full-scale invasion of the home islands, which they're anticipating, it will come at a massive cost. They expected to take enormous casualties, and they saw the bomb as a potential means of breaking the Japanese will and thus avoiding having to embark on this enormously costly invasion.
However, this plan hinged entirely on the successful development of a nuclear bomb, which was made possible on the 16th of July 1945.
Did it though? Did it hinge on the development of the nuclear bomb because at that point you had obvious military superiority, naval superiority, air superiority, and you could have just kept firebombing, essentially. Now, I'm not sure if firebombing 100,000 people to death is any better than a nuclear bomb that kills 100,000 people, but I'm not sure if I agree with that. I don't think that the successful development of a nuclear weapon or not was what decided the end of World War II, even without a full-out ground invasion. You could have just kept conventional bombing, firebombing, I would think.
The Trinity test successfully triggered the world's first
Let me know if you
nuclear
disagree.
explosion.
The Trinity test proved that the bomb worked. What it didn't do is prove that the delivery system worked. So I'm standing here next to a casing that was made for the type of bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. That bomb was called Little Boy. But the type of bomb that Little Boy was had not been tested before it was dropped on Hiroshima. It was a different type of device to the one that was tested as part of the Manhattan Project. That device, known as Gadget, was an implosion device. So it had lots of different elements around the edges that imploded on the core in the center and created a far more efficient explosion than this type of device did. This was called a gun device that essentially fired uranium at uranium to create the explosion. So at the Trinity test, the bomb was just put on a huge structure in the middle of the desert. It wasn't loaded onto a plane, and that's something which had never been tested because it couldn't be tested because it could only be done when it was being done for the first time. So there was this additional challenge to confront. How do you get this thing, take it to where you want it to go, and ensure that it does what it's supposed to do without endangering the crew who get it there in the first place and allows them to get home as well?
The answer was this, the B-29 Superfortress.
So the B-29 had only recently come into service, and it afforded America the ability to get across to Japan and to deploy weapons on the Japanese home islands. Of course, from the perspective of the Japanese population, this was a really serious escalation. It made them vulnerable to a series of air raids that preceded the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These raids were devastating in their own right, particularly the firebombing of Tokyo, which had enormous levels of casualties and enormous levels of suffering. So Japanese civilians are made to feel vulnerable under the weight of this device, which is allowing America to bring the war literally right to their door.
The B-29 was a pressurized aircraft, which allowed it to comfortably reach altitudes that were barely attainable by Japanese fighters, meaning it was extremely hard for them to defend against. This made it the obvious choice to carry the atomic bombs, and several B-29s were modified to accommodate this extra weight. But the question remained of where these aircraft would deliver their catastrophic payload.
So when identifying various potential targets for the
Yeah, I believe there was one target that was supposed to be dropped on instead of Nagasaki, but I think there wasn't ideal. Like, there was too much cloud cover, so they had to switch to Nagasaki.
the bomb, there's a range of considerations involved. They want somewhere that hasn't been subject to extensive bombing previously because they need to be able to observe the full capacity of the bomb to destroy what it's been directed towards. That's a really important thing. It has to be a target which has legitimate military credentials. It has to have military infrastructure. It also has to have domestic infrastructure as well, because that's, again, an important metric from their perspective in terms of identifying and observing how destructive the bomb is in real world conditions. In many respects in Japan, that's a kind of a moot issue because it tends to be the case that military infrastructure is surrounded by civilian infrastructure. So that's the case for most of the places they target. So they have a short list of places that they're looking at. Hiroshima is, of course, one of the places that's on the list because it fits all of the different considerations that have been determined for a potential target. And so Hiroshima becomes ultimately and eventually target number one.
At 2:45 a.m. on the 6th of August 1945, Enola Gay took off from the Mariana Islands carrying Little Boy, accompanied by two other observation aircraft. After around 6 hours of flying, the 12-man crew arrived over Hiroshima, and at 8:15 a.m. local time, the world's first nuclear weapon was released. On the ground, an air raid alert had been given around an hour earlier, but this was withdrawn due to the low perceived threat of only 3 approaching aircraft. When the bomb was released around 30,000 feet above the city, the majority of Hiroshima's roughly 350,000 residents were still...
Wow. So the fact that there were fewer planes, of course they didn't know that the Americans had this weapon, made them think like it wasn't even worth going out. So you'd have more people unprotected than you would have in a conventional air raid.
Going about their daily lives. After falling for 43 seconds, Little Boy detonated 2,000 feet above Hiroshima.
The first thing that those on the ground would have been aware of is a blinding flash of light, and that was followed by an eviscerating wave of heat, which evaporated anything and anyone within its direct range. Closely behind that was a catastrophically destructive pressure wave that blasted everything in its path to pieces. It was, in any meaningful sense, the apocalypse made real in that moment.
The aftermath was a scene of utter devastation on a level never before seen. 2/3 of Hiroshima's buildings had been completely flattened. Between 60 and 80,000 people had died within seconds of the blast, many of whom were instantly vaporized. Survivors had grievous burns, and those who were able were running for their lives, fearing another attack. No one in that moment understood what had just happened, and yet their suffering had only just begun.
In the days that follow, a new phenomena begins to emerge as well, something which nobody's encountered before, a range of symptoms that become described as an atomic sickness. These are manifest in various different ways, but they have devastating consequences for those affected, and people are dying from these things which aren't directly related to their injuries as such. It's something else, and of course this is radiation poisoning. This is something which nobody knows how to deal with in the moment because they're not exactly sure what it is and how it's going to develop, and in the days that follow it leads to another wave of deaths, and in the weeks that follow there are more, and of course the long-term consequences are something which we're still trying to figure out today. There is continuing debate amongst scientists and medical professionals about exactly what the long-term repercussions of this exposure to radiation have been for those that encountered it, and in some respects for the generations that followed as well.
The scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project knew radiation would be an issue following the blast, and they even took steps to mitigate the fallout where possible, for example by detonating the bomb in the air rather than on the ground. Their main focus had been on the pure explosive power of the bomb, but the full impact of radiation sickness, particularly its long-term effects, would prove to be another weapon entirely. More people would die in the weeks and months that followed than in the initial blast. Japanese doctors who arrived later initially struggled to understand that their patients were suffering from radiation sickness. Allied doctors would later arrive to treat the survivors, along with scientists and military personnel who would study the effects of the blast over the following months.
So there are various different estimates as to how many people died in the immediate aftermath of the bomb and in the weeks and months that followed, but the toll is catastrophic by any metric. It could be up to about 120,000 people. That is, despite its catastrophic nature, relatively comparable to some of the firebombing, particularly in Tokyo, that had preceded the dropping of the bomb. What's different here is that it's not enormous waves of bombers that are doing this, dropping an enormous number of different devices across a large area. This is ultimately one plane with one device dropped at one time in one instance, doing all of this destruction in a matter of seconds.
Initially, the Japanese leadership did not understand what had just happened. Then, 16 hours after the bomb had leveled Hiroshima, President Truman made an announcement to the world. He revealed not only that atomic bombs existed, but that America had just used one to destroy an entire city.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
America had just used one to destroy an entire city.
We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. Harry Truman, 1945.
So whilst the Japanese are still trying to figure out exactly what's happened at Hiroshima and how to deal with it, the Americans drop a second device at Nagasaki. So the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was a gun-type device. The bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was an implosion device. So theoretically, it's far more efficient and has the potential to be far more destructive. As it happens, whilst the raid on Hiroshima went perfectly according to plan, the raid on Nagasaki didn't. That means that the bomb wasn't dropped where it had been intended to be dropped, and that it had actually less destruction than it could have done.
Fat Man exploded 2 miles short of Nagasaki's center, instantly killing around 38,000 people, far less than the estimated 100,000 deaths had it hit its mark. However, Nagasaki was not the initial target. Instead, it was the city of Kokura. The crew of Boxcar made 3 passes over the city, but cloudy weather obstructed the target.
Right.
Truman had given explicit orders that the atomic bombs had to be dropped visually without using radar, which forced the crew of Boxcar to move on to their secondary target of Nagasaki. Once they arrived, with only enough fuel for one run, cloud cover posed yet more problems. That was until the bombardier reported a small gap in the clouds, just large enough to make the drop. Official reports referenced this as the reason that Fat Man was delivered so far off target, but others weren't as convinced. One observer from the earlier Hiroshima missions said he took the story of the gap in the clouds with, quote, a grain of salt, as the miss was similar to that of radar bombing.
It wasn't even necessarily the plan that it should be dropped on the 9th of August. It was initially planned to be dropped on the 11th of August, but weather conditions meant that the date was brought forward because they were considered more favourable on the 9th. When the second bomb was dropped, Japan really hadn't had too much time to react to what had happened. It's not necessarily the case that it was kind of a strategic decision from America's perspective to put another bomb in behind the one on Hiroshima to sort of reinforce the point in the way that it might appear. It was to do with climactic conditions and circumstances as much as anything else. But it's certainly the case that when the second bomb was dropped, anything that Japan was thinking about doing was by necessity already in motion, because they hadn't had time to really meaningfully, properly process what had already happened on the 6th of August, only a few days prior.
Right.
The fact that the two arrived so close together did suggest on some level that there could be a series more. The only people who knew that there were only 2 usable bombs at the time were those who were very closely connected to the project and the president and those around him. From a global perspective, and certainly from Japan's perspective, there was a real possibility that they had a whole succession of these things lined up. And in fairness, that was America's intention too. They just hadn't been able to get to the point where they had them ready at that stage. On the 9th of August, what also happened is the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. And in doing so, they declared war on Japan.
Okay. So the US wanted to ensure that they would get full surrender and control of Japan rather than having a joint occupation like Germany.
And so now Japan are confronted with 2 separate issues.
Japan had just suffered 2 devastating attacks, and Truman had promised to continue until they surrendered. Meanwhile, the Soviets, who some Japanese officials had been hoping could mediate a more favourable peace deal, were now at war with them as well. If the war continued, a full-scale invasion of mainland Japan was sure to follow, with death and destruction on an unimaginable scale.
Yeah, but the problem with that now from the American perspective, I'm not saying that you should drop more and more bombs, but seeing from their perspective, they want a full control of Japan. They don't want, even if it has to come to invasion of both Soviet and American forces, then America is going to have to consolidate some land to the Soviets where they wanted the whole of Japan.
The choice was seemingly obvious. Despite the opposition of many military leaders and even a failed coup trying to prevent it, on the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito officially announced Japan's surrender. They agreed to the Allies' unconditional terms with one exception. The Emperor was to remain in post.
In Truman's mind, whilst he knew this was a weapon of unprecedented destructive capacity, he was essentially ultimately treating it like another weapon in the context of the war. And so when he allowed for its use in Japan, he didn't give explicit instructions as to what dates it should be dropped, other than saying it shouldn't be dropped before the 3rd of August. He didn't give explicit dates as to where it should be dropped. He didn't give explicit instructions as to when it should be dropped. After the bombing of Nagasaki, that changed. After the bombing of Nagasaki, he issued an explicit order saying that no more atomic bombs should be dropped without his explicit instruction. So of course we ask ourselves why that might be. And it seems pretty clear from what he said and what he wrote at the time that he realized, as did the world, that this was something different and that he couldn't contemplate the human cost of using these devices again unless he considered that there were extraordinarily good reasons for doing so. The decision to drop the bombs on Japan remains extraordinarily controversial right up until the present day. There are those who maintain that the war would have ended without having to use them. There are those who maintain that even if it did ultimately have a significant role in forcing Japan's hand, that simply cannot be justified by the human cost involved. That is something which is unjustifiable under any circumstances. There are those who maintain elsewhere that it wasn't in fact the bombs that ended the Second World War in Asia and the Pacific. It was the Soviet Union's decision to declare war on Japan and to invade Manchuria. These are the subjects of ongoing discussion, and ultimately the likelihood is we'll never arrive at a consensus answer.
Well, I'm sure even without the actually, no, I'm not sure. I was going to say, I'm sure that even without the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan, the fact that America had the weapons and used them, Japan would still surrender. But now I take that back, because Japan did see the Soviet Union, before they declared war on Japan, as a possible mediator to avoid complete unconditional surrender to the Americans. So maybe that is the case. Is it different? And I'm going to rewind to some of these horrific pictures just to... Is it different than an all-out military assault or a firebombing? If they kill the same amount of people, I'm not sure it is. But the pure indiscriminate nature of an atomic bomb, meaning that if you drop it, even as destructive and uncaring a firebomb raid might be, with an atomic bomb, there's no, it's you kill everyone, you know? And so that's where this is horrific.
Is the declared discussion and ultimate thing about the decision to drop the bomb. It meant that from that moment onwards, whilst the decision to drop the bomb might have played some role in the end of the Second World War, it certainly had a critical role in the war that followed. The other really significant thing about the decision to drop the bomb, of course, is that it introduced humanity to the nuclear age. It meant that from that moment onwards, all of us would live in various ways under the shadow of the bomb, because of course, whilst the decision to drop the bomb might have played some role in the end of the Second World War, it certainly had a critical role in the war that followed. It became the central and defining part of the Cold War.
And today,
as the only country in the world who has suffered a nuclear attack, Japan remains, to this day, a strictly anti-nuclear state, maintaining 3 non-nuclear principles of not producing, possessing, or permitting nuclear weapons on their land. Today, where the world's first nuclear weapon detonated 80 years ago, stands Peace Memorial Park, dedicated to the legacy of Hiroshima and the memories of the bomb's victims.
It's a great video, a horrifying topic, but important point in history. I asked everything I wanted to say, said everything I wanted to say in the video, so love y'all. Hope you guys are all doing well. Great channel, Imperial War Museums. Would appreciate any comments down below. You guys are always so awesome in that in the comment sections. I'm always amazed, very happy. yeah, and I hope I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning together, watching videos. Bye, guys.